Here are two of my maxims. If most of our morality is contested, we argue about it, we're in trouble. If most of our action requires ethical analysis, we're also in trouble. We find ourselves making decisions all day, every day. Rarely do we have the time needed to weigh every issue that could be relevant, let alone the time to figure out which issues might be relevant. Almost all our actions are based on habits of action, doing what we've done before. What we do as individuals is normally common to what most of the people around us are doing. When there is noticeable variance, we get in trouble and feel stressed. We don't have the time and resources to be stressed all the time. What does it tell us about a society when there are deep ethical differences and disagreements on many subjects? This seems most common when we are majoring on our differences than when we major on our commonalities. This can happen whether we are thinking primarily in individualistic or groupish terms. What does it tell us about a society when there are so few, or we think there are so few, agreements about many subjects? Ethics is an inquiry into the nature of the good life and how to achieve it. There are some important consequences once we begin with this definition. First, ethics as an inquiry is an ongoing conversation. None of us, either in our first ethics class or our own first questions about whether doing a thing is right or wrong, good or bad, are beginning with a blank slate. We always find ourselves, whether we're aware of it or not, in situations that have, at least to some degree, been thought about and considered before. As Alistair McIntyre puts it, we enter upon a stage we did not design, and we find ourselves part of an action that was not of our own making. Each of us, being a main character in his own drama, plays subordinate parts in the dramas of others, and each drama constrains the others. As we'll see later, this reality is part of the background of his approach to the idea of traditions of moral inquiry. Coming to the study of ethics this semester, we are joining a conversation that didn't start with us. It also won't end with us. McIntyre begins his discussion of traditions of moral inquiry in his book After Virtue, but gives the fullest definition in his next book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? Before we examine that extended definition, consider the title of the book. Justice and rationality are both important things in our world. To the extent that we aim to be good, we think about justice. To the extent that we want to be smart or to see things as they are, we think about rationality. What we find when we consider these two things, justice and rationality, is that both are contested concepts. McIntyre's historical and cross-cultural approach helps us see that it is common for different accounts of justice and rationality to find their homes in different traditions. Consider broadly, for example, the traditions of natural science and Christian theology. Both value rationality. Both think being rational is very valuable and worth working to achieve. Both offer different accounts, however, of exactly what it means to be rational and how to achieve rationality. There is similarity, but not identity between these accounts. Or consider current day Republicans and Democrats. Both talk about and value justice. If you pay much attention, however, it doesn't take long to notice that they don't mean exactly the same thing by the term. Here's McIntyre's definition of a tradition. A tradition is an argument extended through time in which certain fundamental agreements are defined and redefined in terms of two kinds of conflict: those with critics and enemies external to the tradition, who reject all or at least key parts of those fundamental agreements, and those internal interpretive debates through which the meaning and rationale of the fundamental agreements come to be expressed and by whose progress a tradition is constituted. A tradition, as understood by McIntyre, has several features. Less obvious in this definition, but clearer in his book, After Virtue, a tradition is socially embodied. Though we might discover the elements of a tradition by reading a book that represents that tradition, it is people who make up and carry on the tradition. A tradition happens among people and their social institutions. Second, a tradition exists in time. There is a sense in which they are living, subject to the vicissitudes of their environments. Third, a tradition is defined by a set of fundamental agreements. No tradition includes everything. Most things, in fact, are indifferent in the scope of any given tradition. But what makes a tradition this tradition and not some other is the set of fundamental agreements that make it what it is. Fourth, all traditions are subject to conflict. Some of these conflicts are internal, some are external. These conflicts never end unless the tradition dies. It is the reality of continuing conflict that constitutes the tradition's existence through time. Also, this conflict is neither good nor bad. It simply is. Let's go more slowly. Traditions happen through time. They can be placed in a history and themselves have a history. As we look at them in their historical context and how they themselves have transformed through history, we gain a better understanding of the traditions. Traditions that deny their own historicity, that is, traditions that think of themselves as merely timeless universal truths, will always, to some degree, fail to understand themselves well. There are boundaries between traditions. A tradition might be closely related, for instance, sub-traditions of a larger tradition. For example, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed Judaism can be understood as three sub-traditions of Judaism, the larger tradition. The fundamental agreements that constitute a tradition, that make it what it is, are of various kinds. Traditions have fundamental agreements that are theoretical, about what the world is and how it works. They're practical, which actions are important and why, and social, the shared social institutions that make up the traditions and by which those traditions are expressed and advanced in the world. There are two kinds of conflict that form and drive a tradition, internal and external conflicts. Since my specialty is the philosophical and theological tradition of Christianity, that's the one I know best. In the Christian tradition, there are internal interpretive debates about how to understand or apply particular scripture texts. Broadly speaking, the Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches share the same scripture. Sharing the same scripture does not lead to reading or applying that scripture the same way. Ongoing debate within these sub-traditions continues to shape the larger Christian tradition on the macro level. Similarly, at the very beginning of what we today call Christianity, it was once one way of being Jewish. If you'd walked up to Jesus and said, "Hey, Mr. Jesus, are you starting a new religion?" he wouldn't have known what to say. Setting aside the lack of a common language and the anachronism of our modern category religion, Jesus looked like, acted like, and talked like what we would call a Jew. In succeeding generations, debates over the status of Jesus generated and came to sustain the boundaries between the traditions we now call Judaism and Christianity. Let's go back to the temporal factor again. New interpretive debates and situations are continually coming along. A living tradition never stands still. It is never unchanging. All living traditions change as they face new arguments and challenges and situations from within and from without. Let's consider definitions for just a minute. Well, not any particular definitions, but the whole idea of having definitions. I think definitions are helpful to some extent. What do you think? If my wife says, "Can you take the trash out?" it helps if we have some common definitions of what the words and phrases mean. What is the meaning of trash? What action constitutes taking the trash out? Not all definitions are uncontested, As children, we're introduced to the idea of a dictionary as the repository of definitions. If we want to know the definition of a word, that is, what it means, we're taught to look it up in the dictionary. We learn that dictionaries are helpful. As we age and our experience broadens, we may find dictionaries less useful. We come to see that many words have more than one meaning. It can take years of experience in a linguistic community to figure out the meanings of words in their various contexts. We learn that words have shades of meaning and that these shades shift from context to context. You'll experience this slippery quality of words in this course, as you would in any course in philosophy. The slipperiness of the words is by no means unique to philosophical disciplines. The advantage or disadvantage, depending on your point of view, is that within philosophy, it's common to point at this slipperiness and even to revel in it sometimes. Let's consider some of the broad approaches to ethics that are on offer. It's worth our while to consider these traditional approaches. We'll be looking at consequentialist, deontological, religious, character-based, egoistic, justice, and rights-based approaches to ethics in this course. We'll, in general, take 1 week on each. Consequences are what matter to a consequentialist. Duh. Seems obvious, doesn't it? A consequentialist approach to ethics asks about what results from an action. An action with good consequences is a good action. An action with bad consequences is a bad action. Yes, that's vastly oversimplified. We'll get to more detail later in the course. The most famous version of consequentialism these days is utilitarianism. Egoism, which we'll look at in a moment, is also a consequentialist ethic. There's a little word in Greek, dei, delta, epsilon, iota. It is an impersonal verb used to indicate necessity, that something must be done. This is the origin of the word deontology, the approach to ethics that is rooted in duty. Duty tells us what we must do. A deontological approach to ethics tells us what is right and wrong and enjoins us to do the right thing. Within religious ethics, a divine command approach, that is, an approach that works from a list of commands given by a god or set of gods, is a deontological approach to ethics. Within the broader philosophical ethical tradition, Kantianism, the form of ethics that we get from philosopher Immanuel Kant, is the most famous version of deontology. Throughout history and across cultures, phenomena and institutions we call religious have been quite common. Within these social phenomena, there are various approaches to ethics. Divine command is a common approach. When you hear someone say that all we need to do is obey the 10 commandments, you're likely dealing with a divine command theorist, even if that person is not schooled enough in ethical theory to call it a divine command theory. Divine command is not the only religious approach to ethics, however. A natural law approach to ethics says something like, this is the way the world is. We need to live in accordance with the way the world is. A religious version of natural law ethics would make a connection to the role of a god or a set of gods in making the world the way it is. Non-religious versions of natural law ethics could look at the world as shorn of any connection to the divine, yet still worth bending our actions toward. A few religious traditions make much of a narrative approach to ethics. This is where I myself come down. Narrative approaches consider humans as living within a story, and their actions constitute moves to advance that storyline. Good or right actions are intelligible and make sense within that story. Some would like to reject religious approaches to ethics altogether. One reason given is the phenomenon called fundamentalism. It's normal to use that epithet fundamentalist in a pejorative sense. It's something bad. It's been said, for example, that within fundamentalism, there is no fun, not much mental, but lots of damn. The concept of fundamentalism has a history, a rather recent history, in fact. Some even suggest that there are non-religious forms of fundamentalism. Character or virtue ethics have as a basic question, what kind of person should I be? Related questions include, how do I become this kind of person? Why should I want to be this kind of person? What are the consequences of being this kind of person? As you can see, this is a broader approach, or certainly less punctiliar than approaches that look narrowly at actions alone. Character ethics originated in ancient times. Our first book this semester, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, is associated with this approach. You can find this way of thinking not only in early Greek philosophers, but in most cultures around the world. Egoistic ethics might be one of the hardest to understand. This is because we think that being egotistical or self-centered is the opposite of being ethical. If I want to be ethical, if I want to be moral, I need to not be self-centered. But notice that the words egoist and egotist are not the same. The ethical approach that we're going to be looking at uses the former word egoist, not the latter egotist. Egoistic approaches to ethics say our actions should be driven by the question, what is in my own self-interest? One aspect of this approach, psychological egoism, is a descriptive thesis. It claims to be describing reality. They say that when we look at what people do, whatever their words say, they are in fact doing what they take to be in their own self-interest. Ethical egoism is a normative thesis. Its claim is that people ought to do what is in their own self-interest. Some of you may have a problem with that idea. Well, wait until we get to that section of the course and see what you think. Justice-based theories of ethics will ask what is the just thing to do. These approaches rarely stand alone. If we were to look at Plato's Republic, we could see that it is framed as a discussion of the nature of dikaiosune. This Greek word is variously translated as justice, righteousness, or morality. These three words don't mean the same thing in English, but we can say that they're in the same semantic ballpark. A more modern approach to ethics is based on human rights. The basic idea is to identify what rights people have and then see how we can respect those rights. The list of rights attributed to people is expanding in recent years. Let's consider some more basic concepts and questions. Is there such a quality as being moral? What is it that makes something moral? Is it a matter of the content? For example, if it pertains to harm or care, is it a moral matter? Or is it a particular kind of approach that makes something moral? Perhaps it is engaging in some kind of deliberation or looking for a right or wrong judgment that makes something moral. Are there any decisions we make that are not moral decisions? Is whether to go to college, vocational school, join the military, or to get a job a moral decision? Is the decision, for example, between studying psychology or math a moral decision? Is the decision whether and whom to marry a moral decision? What about the question of attire? Can the wearing of clothes or the wearing of particular styles or fabrics of particular compositions be moral issues? What about hairstyle? What about eating? In part 3 of this presentation, we'll look at some more basic concepts.